Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel and welcome to yet another Star Trek book review, because today we are going to be reviewing the Autobiography of Katheryn Janeway by Una McCormack. Right up front, I'm just going to let you know that this book does address the most pressing question that all of us Star Trek fans have. Did Janeway feel guilty for killing Tuvix? Did it haunt her to the end of her days as well? It should.
Doesn't anyone see that this is wrong?
Yes, that is actually talked about in this book, but there's a lot more to this book, and I have to say that I really enjoyed it. For those of you who don't know what this book is, this is the latest book in a kind of series that they've been releasing, where they kind of release these like pseudo autobiographies by characters within the Star Trek universe. They've done one for Kirk, Spock, Picard, I believe. Obviously, they're written by real people. This one obviously is done by Una McCormack, but the books kind of pretend that they're being written by the actual characters of the book, and it kind of gives you an overview, just like any autobiography would be, of the character's life as told through their perspective. And it really just provides a really unique glimpse into Katheryn Janeway in specific. I have not read any of the other three versions of this. I bet they're wonderful, but honestly, Janeway was the one that I was kind of most intrigued by, because she's the one that we honestly kind of have the least fleshing out of her pre-Voyager time. Like, we get little hints and pieces of it in the show, but honestly, we don't get a ton of that. Whereas like Kirk, Spock, and Picard all have fairly well fleshed out backstories before they actually get to where they are within their own respective shows. I also should say that I read this one in specific because they actually finally released the audiobook version of these books. The other autobiography novels did not have audio dramas or audio versions of them available, and because I'm busy, I like to listen to the audiobook version of a lot of the books that I read. And in particular, I call that out in specific. I normally don't mention that, but I call that out in specific because this audiobook was read by Kate Mulgrew herself, Captain Janeway, and she does a phenomenal performance just throughout the whole book, just delivering like the weight and feel of Captain Janeway. I mean, quite obviously, she played Captain Janeway for 7 years, and so of course she's going to bring that sort of characterization to the audiobook, I should say. It really feels like an audio drama, even though it is just her speaking. So I do want to highlight right up front that listening to this being read by Kate Mulgrew really added to the experience of the book. But let's actually focus in on the book itself. As I joked about, this book does have a section of the book that is kind of talking about Janeway's experiences on Voyager. It kind of chronicles the events of those 7 years of the show, and that's sort of the latter part of the book. And actually, when I kind of stepped into this book, I actually thought that that was going to be the part of the book that was going to be the most intriguing for me. I thought that I was going to like, oh, it's going to be kind of like a highlight reel of a lot of the Voyager stuff, and we'll get a little bit more of the behind the scenes of what Janeway was thinking and feeling during those moments. And kind of honestly, that is what does end up happening during those sections of the book, and it's kind of like the last half of the book that is that. But I will say, it honestly was the least interesting part of the novel for me, and I'm actually kind of surprised by that, because a lot of it does kind of feel like it is that kind of highlight reel of the novel, but it is a lot, because it is an autobiography, there's this feeling from Una McCormack that it's just kind of like telling us the plot of what happened, because Janeway's sort of like telling this story within universe, so she's kind of reciting events, and she does kind of give some personal history and backstory to those episodes that we see within the show. Like, for example, the Tuvix episode that I sort of joked about, we get a little bit of insight into Janeway's decisions in that episode, and the sort of decisions that she's wrestling with, and the fact that she still to this day does not entirely feel comfortable with the choice that she made, as well she should not be. And there's sort of some interesting sort of backstory that comes from earlier in the novel, sort of playing into that. And so I like that sort of seeding of different elements of like what Janeway was feeling during specific moments, and some interesting like little narrative through lines there as well. There's even a nice little call out to kind of a subtle call out to In the Pale Moonlight, and the decisions that Captain Sisko had to make within the context of the Tuvix story, which I thought was just a really cool Una McCormack addition, because Una McCormack, as many people know, is a huge Deep Space Nine writer, and there's a lot of like little Deep Space Nine stuff references in here, mostly to do with the Cardassians, because Una McCormack is a huge Cardassian fan, as we've seen a lot of her other Star Trek novels that she's done. So there's a lot of Cardassian stuff, which I'll come back to in just a minute. But staying on the sort of Voyager segment of this novel, I found that to be the least intriguing. Like, it does kind of get a little bit into plot synopsis with a little bit of hint of like what Janeway was feeling during those times, but a lot of it's just sort of like the greatest hits and is actually not as intriguing as I thought it would be. The kind of most interesting part of that segment of the novel is when Una McCormack kind of ties together different themes that were sort of weaved throughout the entirety of the Voyager story and throughout earlier parts of Janeway's life that she had talked about earlier in the book. I particularly love the like theme of children that weaves itself throughout the entire novel. There's some talk about like Janeway thinking about wanting to have children earlier with her then fiance Mark earlier on in the book, and sort of her sort of mulling that over and what her feelings were about having children, and then that tying into the numerous stories having to do with parentage and children throughout the time on Voyager, where you get into like Naomi Wildman and Icheb and Q's son that appears in Star Trek Voyager. So I liked when Una McCormack sort of took those like different themes, and there's a few of those. The children one is just sort of one of many. Those different themes that you could kind of cherry pick certain episodes throughout Voyager and sort of say like, oh yeah, there is kind of like an interesting through line through here. Another one being like personhood and self that you see with Janeway and the Doctor, or the fact that the integration of the Maquis crew, something that the Voyager show itself didn't really highlight all that well, kind of gets brought up as a sort of a background theme throughout the book. The integration of the Maquis crew into a Starfleet ship, I thought was like nicely well done and kind of nicely interwoven into those segments of the story. But I will say, like I said, that is sort of the least interesting part of this novel, which is surprising because I thought it was going to be the most interesting part to me. But the real triumph of this book is actually the first half, where you get to see the sort of development of who Janeway is and how she became the captain that we all knew. And it was very intriguing and really wonderfully done, just sort of seeing this development of this woman and the sort of stories that informed her life through the eyes of Janeway. And Una McCormack just does a truly, truly beautiful job throughout the first half of this novel, just sort of setting those things up. There are elements of this book that I just did not expect to resonate so strongly with, like Janeway's first chance at having a kind of command position on a Starfleet ship, and her interactions with the captain of that ship, and how the captain of that ship did not like her all that much because Janeway to her was sort of someone who came from a military family, a Starfleet family, and how he sort of saw her as like someone who had just like gotten her position because her name was Janeway, and that her family had a lot of Janeways in Starfleet, and sort of her sort of like balking against that and pushing against that and having to deal with that sort of crisis of her career at that moment, and feeling like, oh, I've earned this, but did I really? And sort of that crisis of consciousness and what it did to inform how she moved forward as a leader, as the future captain. I thought that was deeply, deeply brilliant. Her relationship with different types of commanders and leaders throughout the earlier part of the book is also a defining factor. Her relationship with her father, and her feeling of loss when her father passes away, the different commanders and people that she interacts with, like Owen Paris gets a strong mention throughout the first half of this book as well as other people that Janeway worked with, and her dealing with like learning different types of command. And this also hits upon some people that she knew before we actually get to the events of Star Trek Voyager, but actually main characters in that show. I think mainly of Tuvok. Her relationship with Tuvok and how that evolved is a supremely surprising and deeply interesting part of the novel as well. There's some interesting interactions between her and Tuvok earlier in her career that I found to just really add a lot of depth and inform a lot of the depth of their relationship as we see on the actual show. And so credit to Una McCormack to not taking the sort of obvious route with a lot of these relationships with these characters, but kind of informing them in a really interesting way. Another interesting one is sort of Janeway's relationship to Tom Paris. Obviously, we know that Janeway from the show and in this book and in the early chapters that she had a deep mentorship with Owen Paris. But obviously that would have put her at sort of a kind of to like have slight interactions with Tom Paris before she actually sort of before he becomes part of her crew later on in the show proper. And sort of her perspective on Tom Paris earlier on in his life before he becomes an actual member of her crew. And I like those little insights into how she saw Tom before she actually got to really know him during the situations that we see on Voyager itself. So just really, really wonderful stuff there. But I really, really, really want to focus in on two distinct segments before I wrap out this review. in that I think her early childhood segments are, I think, some of the most beautifully written. The first 2 or 3 chapters of this book, it's so intriguing to see this little girl and see Janeway reflect on this little girl who she was, and how you can see how well it connects to who she became. And yet the failures that she has as a young child that still lead her to learning to be the captain that she eventually becomes. There's one particular story about Janeway failing a tennis tournament that she reacts badly to, and is sort of talked to by her father and sort of informed by her father of about how to be a leader and how to deal with failure and how to deal with problems of that sort. That really kind of informs a lot of what we see on the show. It's just so beautifully done. The second thing, too, that I want to hone in on, and I mentioned this earlier, is Una McCormack's love of Cardassians. Obviously, Una McCormack has written a ton of Deep Space Nine novels, all set on Cardassian, dealing with sort of the post-Dominion War Cardassia, and so Una McCormack just has a true love of Cardassian culture, and that does seep into this novel in an unexpected way. Obviously, the Cardassian skirmishes that were going on at the time when Janeway was entering into Starfleet sort of informed a lot of Janeway's early career, and a lot of her prejudice towards Cardassians, and eventually towards her feelings towards the Maquis, kind of play into the earlier parts of this novel. And it's really interesting to see an elder Janeway sort of kind of reflecting as she's writing this book, quote unquote, kind of looking back on the prejudices she has in her early youth towards the Cardassians, because they are the enemy. They are on the other side of this conflict. And you can clearly see Una McCormack's love of Cardassian culture come out into Janeway's voice quite a little bit too, in terms of Janeway sort of understanding her failures as a younger person to understand Cardassians, and starting to understand that Cardassians are people in their own right, in their own culture, and sort of wrestling with the fact that she did not view these people as people earlier on in her career, because they were the enemies and because they came from a very militaristic society that was very against Starfleet values. And so it was just a very nice melding of something that made sense for Janeway and for her to learn in that point of her career, and also just the actual author of the novel, Una McCormack, who is probably one of my favorite Star Trek authors just in general. I honestly adore her work. She manages to mix the personal and political in a way that I just particularly love. Like, I love a lot of Star Trek authors, that are writing right now, but Una McCormack just does this wonderful mix of being able to take big political conflicts that are going on within the Star Trek world and kind of hone in on a personal reflection of those political events and how they affect people on a very personal level. I saw this in particular in her Star Trek Picard novel that she did, which is a prequel to the series. That really also did that as well, but you also see that in a lot of her Deep Space Nine novels as well. So you can clearly see the author's touch within this work. So credit to Una McCormack for just being able to have her own voice shine through Janeway's voice within this novel. It was truly a masterwork, I think, on her part, and might be one of my personal favorite highlights of the novel. And I gotta say, to sort of wrap this out, this was not a novel that I was expecting to love as much as I did. I am generally someone who likes a little bit more of a focused narrative than sort of like a broad, sweeping personal life story. And I love Janeway. And I love that character. I think she's a very underappreciated captain in a lot of discussions of sort of great leadership roles within Star Trek. And so I thought I was going to be intrigued by that. That's why I was sort of most intrigued by this autobiography for this character, and the fact that Kate Mulgrew read the audiobook certainly helped that. But I just didn't expect to end up loving this as much as I did, and even more so loving the parts of this novel that I thought were going to be the least interesting parts to me. I thought I was going to be like, all right, let's skip past the early parts so I can get to the Star Trek Voyager stuff. But the Star Trek Voyager stuff ended up being the least interesting part to me. The last thing that I want to end on to sort of wrap out this review is the last chapter of the book, which I kind of find very intriguing, because the last chapter of the book kind of focuses on what happens with the Voyager crew after they arrive back in the Alpha Quadrant at the end of the show, which obviously takes place after the events of the show Star Trek Voyager. Now, I will say, if you're looking for like hints of what happens in Star Trek Picard with like 7 of 9 and things like that, this novel doesn't get that far. I would go so far as to say that it probably doesn't even get up to like where we see Admiral Janeway in Nemesis, where she's sort of an admiral. There's sort of little hints of that. But it doesn't get that far. However, I do find that chapter to be particularly intriguing, though, on the back of the recent announcement of Star Trek Prodigy and the fact that Janeway is going to appear in that show. Now, quite possibly Una McCormack, I don't know how much she knows of what's going to be happening in that show. She may know nothing of what's happening in that show, so she just may have written this chapter and just sort of just wrote what she thought would have happened to the Voyager crew afterwards, and just sort of naturally. As I said, she doesn't even really hint at much stuff that happens in Star Trek Picard in terms of 7 of 9, for example. But there are a few intriguing hints of oh, that's a rather specific and interesting thing to kind of add here that happens post-Voyager. And again, it's very quick, very small, but I'm like, I wonder if that's because that seems like something that might play into Star Trek Prodigy, given the little bones of what we know that story of being, that it has Janeway, and that it's focusing on Janeway interacting with children. And sort of a child crew in Star Trek and in the Starfleet. And so I'm kind of intrigued because there is some elements in that last chapter that may not end up being used at all in that show. Again, I have no idea how much Una McCormack knew, but given the integration of a lot of authors getting access to current Star Trek projects, I wouldn't be surprised if those little hints might play into Prodigy. So, if you're looking towards possible hints towards future Star Trek projects, I obviously can't promise that this is what's going to be the case, if this is going to end up being a pseudo-canon hint going on in this novel, but it could possibly be, and even if not, it is definitely intriguing, the sort of hints of the post-Voyager events that this novel hints at. So overall, I think this is a really wonderful novel, a really beautiful novel that mixes Janeway's voice with the author's own voice, sort of seeing Una McCormack's own voice develop throughout all the Star Trek novels that I've read of hers, and also offers some intriguing hints, possibly, with an asterisk on possibly there, for future Star Trek projects. So overall, great novel. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend even more so the audiobook version of it, because then you get Kate Mulgrew's dulcet. Is that my impression of Kate Mulgrew? This is my Kate Mulgrew. I feel this feels offensive. I feel like my apologies to Kate Mulgrew. Please don't hate me for that. You get Kate Mulgrew's just wonderful, wonderful voice. No one has a better, more distinctive voice than Kate Mulgrew. It's just I want Kate Mulgrew to read all my books for me, because she just has the loveliest voice, especially for narrating. And the fact that she is playing Janeway once again is truly a treat. So the audiobook is definitely a treat, and the novel itself, regardless of if you listen to the audiobook version, is a treat as well. So overall, highly recommend, but I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you like this novel? Did you like any of the other autobiographies that I haven't read? I would love to hear your thoughts. If you've read any of the other autobiographies, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you think they're worthwhile. I have a Patreon page that you can help me out on, and help me do more of this on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe. That's the YouTube prayer, right? Subscribe, comment, Patreon, all that stuff. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. And also save Tuvix. Patrons, you are my patrons. You are so awesome. So here are your names: Katheryn Lambeth, Eli Berg Moss, Ashley Allen, Bo Kikio, Miranda Janelle, Ashlyn Solstice, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Camille T, Randy Thompson, Stephen Schuhart, Boyd Earl, and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Rick Osborne, Roar, Ish the Mad, Piston Twisted Garage, Dominic Noble, Buttoneer, John Steele, Michael Beam, Gavin Robinson, Carmen Olson, William Stewart, Amanda Ronya, Hannah F., Nathan Olson, Andrew Jorgensen, BBD, Jason Knott, Maeve, saying it twice because I can, Andrew K., Bree Beecher, Jasmine, Nathan Steele, Skylar Gray, Lily, Tiffany Danger, Sean Piper, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Bush, Jane Packard, Geek, Filter, Mari Neckard, Jacob Tovar, Polymenia, Celestial Dawn, Jean Mithun, Sarah Bystam Din, Mark the Edge, Corey Honkanen, and Vale the Pale Dunn, Lysa, W. Randy Eady, Andrew Lamoureux, Zone 1 Librarian, and finally, Michael Hardy. I am sorry for that, but seriously, thank you so much, patrons. You really mean the world to me, and you really are changing my life, even if I may have changed your life for the worst with my singing. Thank you so much for all of your support.